In this podcast episode, Chris Moritz delves into the complex and troubling transformation of California, particularly under the influence of Kamala Harris and the broader Democratic Party. He discusses the various factors that have contributed to the state's decline, the rise of criminality, and the implications of these changes for the future of California and the nation as a whole. Moritz begins by reflecting on the dramatic shift in California's reputation, once considered the greatest place on earth, to a state plagued by crime and chaos. He notes that many Californians are now fleeing the state, leading to a sense of disbelief among those who remember its former glory. The discussion highlights the stark contrast between the California of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, which was characterized by prosperity and opportunity, and the current state, which many view as a disaster. Moritz emphasizes that while Kamala Harris cannot be solely blamed for this decline, her policies and actions as Attorney General and later as Vice President have played a significant role in shaping the current landscape. The conversation touches on the broader implications of this decline, suggesting that California serves as a warning for the rest of the nation. Moritz argues that the state's descent into chaos is not merely a local issue, but a reflection of systemic failures that could potentially spread to other parts of the country. He posits that the erosion of societal norms and the rise of criminality in California could serve as a precursor to similar trends elsewhere, making it imperative for citizens to recognize and address these issues before they become entrenched. Moritz provides a critical analysis of Kamala Harris's political career, particularly her tenure as Attorney General of California. He argues that Harris's policies have contributed to the state's current crisis, particularly her support for criminal justice reforms that have led to a surge in crime. He discusses the implications of her decisions, such as the dismantling of the Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement, which had been instrumental in combating organized crime and drug trafficking. Moritz contends that Harris's actions reflect a broader trend within the Democratic Party, which prioritizes ideological goals over public safety and the rule of law. The podcast also explores Harris's political motivations, suggesting that her rise to power has been driven more by opportunism than by a genuine commitment to justice or public service. Moritz argues that Harris's focus on identity politics and her willingness to align herself with radical elements within the party have further exacerbated the challenges facing California. He emphasizes that her leadership style is characterized by a lack of accountability and a failure to address the root causes of crime, ultimately leaving the state's residents vulnerable to the very forces she claims to combat. A significant portion of the discussion centers on the impact of criminal justice reform initiatives in California, particularly those championed by Harris and other progressive leaders. Moritz highlights the unintended consequences of these reforms, which were intended to reduce mass incarceration, but have instead led to a rise in crime and violence. He points to specific legislation, such as AB 109 and Prop 47, which reclassified certain crimes and reduced penalties, as examples of how well-meaning policies can have disastrous outcomes. Moritz argues that these reforms have created a culture of impunity among criminals, emboldening them to commit acts of violence and theft without fear of significant repercussions. He cites statistics showing a dramatic increase in property crimes and violent offenses since the implementation of these laws, illustrating the disconnect between the intentions of lawmakers and the realities faced by ordinary citizens. The conversation underscores the need for a reevaluation of criminal justice policies to ensure that they prioritize public safety and accountability. The podcast delves into the alarming rise of gang violence and cartel influence in California, with Moritz asserting that the state is effectively under the control of Mexican drug cartels. He explains how the cartels have established a foothold in California, leveraging their power to intimidate local gangs and control drug distribution networks. Moritz argues that this shift has resulted in a significant increase in violence and criminal activity, as gangs are forced to adapt to the new reality imposed by the cartels. Moritz also discusses the implications of this cartel influence for law enforcement and public safety. He notes that the presence of powerful criminal organizations has created a climate of fear among both citizens and police officers, leading to a breakdown in trust and cooperation. The podcast highlights the challenges faced by law enforcement in combating organized crime, particularly in a political environment that often prioritizes leniency over accountability. Moritz's insights paint a grim picture of a state where the rule of law is increasingly undermined by the very forces that are supposed to uphold it. The conversation touches on the role of immigration in shaping California's current landscape, with Moritz arguing that the influx of undocumented immigrants has contributed to the state's challenges. He discusses how policies that prioritize the rights of illegal immigrants over those of citizens have created a sense of injustice and resentment among the population. Moritz emphasizes that while many immigrants come seeking a better life, the lack of effective integration and support systems has led to increased tensions and social fragmentation. Moritz also highlights the economic implications of unchecked immigration, noting that it has placed a strain on public resources and services. He argues that the focus on accommodating new arrivals has come at the expense of long-term residents, particularly those in marginalized communities. The podcast raises important questions about the balance between compassion and practicality in immigration policy, urging listeners to consider the broader consequences of current approaches. Throughout the podcast, Moritz critiques the role of the elite in perpetuating the problems facing California. He argues that the wealthy and powerful have largely insulated themselves from the consequences of their policies, living in gated communities and employing private security while the rest of the population grapples with rising crime and deteriorating living conditions. Moritz contends that this disconnect has fostered a culture of complacency among the elite, who prioritize their own interests over the well-being of the broader community. The discussion also touches on the influence of big tech companies in shaping California's political landscape. Moritz suggests that the tech elite have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, as their wealth and power are often tied to the very policies that contribute to social unrest. He argues that this dynamic creates a feedback loop where the interests of the elite take precedence over the needs of ordinary citizens, further entrenching the problems facing the state. Moritz emphasizes the erosion of public trust in government institutions as a critical factor in California's decline. He argues that the failure of leaders to address the concerns of their constituents has led to widespread disillusionment and apathy among the population. Moritz points out that many residents feel abandoned by their elected officials, who seem more focused on advancing their own agendas than on serving the needs of the community. The podcast highlights the consequences of this erosion of trust, including increased polarization and a growing sense of hopelessness among citizens. Moritz suggests that restoring faith in government will require a fundamental shift in leadership and accountability, urging listeners to demand more from their elected representatives. He argues that without a renewed commitment to transparency and responsiveness, California's challenges will only continue to worsen. As the conversation progresses, Moritz reflects on the future of California and the potential for change. He acknowledges that the current situation is dire, but he also expresses hope that a new generation of leaders may emerge to address the state's challenges. Moritz emphasizes the importance of grassroots activism and community engagement in driving meaningful change, urging listeners to take an active role in shaping the future of their state. Moritz also discusses the potential for a political realignment in California, suggesting that the growing dissatisfaction with the status quo could lead to new opportunities for reform. He argues that as more residents become aware of the consequences of current policies, there may be a shift toward more pragmatic and effective governance. The podcast concludes with a call to action, encouraging listeners to remain vigilant and engaged in the fight for a better California. The podcast delves into the challenges faced by law enforcement in California, with Moritz highlighting the impact of progressive policies on police effectiveness. He argues that the current political climate has created an environment where officers are often vilified and demoralized, leading to a decline in morale and effectiveness. Moritz emphasizes that this erosion of trust between law enforcement and the community has serious implications for public safety. Moritz also discusses the need for a reevaluation of policing strategies, advocating for a return to more traditional approaches that prioritize accountability and community engagement. He argues that effective policing requires a strong partnership between law enforcement and the communities they serve, urging listeners to support efforts to rebuild that trust. The podcast underscores the importance of recognizing the challenges faced by police officers while also holding them accountable for their actions. Moritz touches on the role of media in shaping public perceptions of crime and governance in California. He argues that the media often sensationalizes crime stories while downplaying the systemic issues that contribute to rising violence and disorder. Moritz suggests that this focus on individual incidents rather than broader trends can create a distorted view of reality, leading to increased fear and anxiety among residents. The podcast also highlights the need for responsible journalism that seeks to inform and educate the public rather than simply entertain. Moritz emphasizes that a well-informed citizenry is essential for holding leaders accountable and driving meaningful change. He urges listeners to critically evaluate the information they consume and to seek out diverse perspectives on the issues facing California. Throughout the discussion, Moritz emphasizes the importance of civic engagement in addressing the challenges facing California. He argues that citizens must take an active role in shaping their communities and holding elected officials accountable. Moritz encourages listeners to become informed about local issues, participate in elections, and advocate for policies that prioritize public safety and well-being. The podcast underscores the idea that meaningful change is possible when individuals come together to demand better governance. Moritz suggests that grassroots movements and community organizing can play a crucial role in driving reform and restoring trust in government institutions. He concludes by urging listeners to remain engaged and committed to the fight for a better future for California.